This happened years ago when I was in college. People ask me why I became a child psychologist. They assume it's because I want to help kids, which is true, but it's not the whole truth. The full truth is that when I was 10 years old, something happened on my school bus that no adult believed. And I swore to myself that when I grew up, I would be the kind of adult who actually listened to his kid. We lived in a suburb of Atlanta called Dunmore Hills. I was in 4th grade. My older brother Marcus was in 7th. We rode the same bus, Bus 19, every single day. Bus 19 had 42 seats. On most mornings, it was about half full. The driver was a woman named Patrice, heavyset and warm, with big earrings and a habit of playing gospel music quietly on a little portable radio she kept clipped to the sun visor. I loved her. Every kid on that bus loved her. She remembered your name by the second day of school, and she would fight any parent who showed up angry. She was that kind of woman. In October of 4th grade, Patrice called out sick. The substitute was a man we'd never seen before, a white man with short gray hair who told us his name was Mr. Haas. He drove correctly, stopped at all the right places, followed the route. Nothing about him was outwardly wrong. He just gave me a feeling I couldn't name at 10 years old. Now that I work with children every day, I know exactly what that feeling was. It was the feeling of someone who is watching too carefully. He drove us for 3 days while Miss Patrice was out. On the second day, a boy named Curtis didn't get off at his stop. Curtis was in 2nd grade. He sat 2 rows ahead of me, always alone because he was small and shy and the older kids ignored him. He always got off at Briar Lane, the 4th stop on the return trip. That day, the bus stopped at Briar Lane. The doors opened. Curtis did not move. Marcus, who was sitting in the back, didn't notice. Most of the other kids didn't notice. But I was watching Curtis because earlier that day, he'd dropped his lunchbox in the aisle and I'd picked it up for him. And I'd noticed he seemed spacey and strange all afternoon, staring out the window at nothing. When the bus doors closed and we pulled away from Briar Lane with Curtis still on board, I leaned over the seat. "Curtis," I whispered, "that was your stop." He turned to look at me. His eyes were open, but they looked wrong, too steady, not blinking. And he said in a voice that was just slightly too flat to be a child's voice, "I know." Then he turned back to the window. I sat frozen for a second. Then I did what 10-year-old me thought was the right thing. I went to the front and told Mr. Haas. I said Curtis had missed his stop. I expected him to pull over, to radio in, to do whatever bus drivers do when a kid misses a stop. Mr. Haas looked at me in the wide rearview mirror. He looked at me for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "He told me he's going to a different stop today." "His mom didn't tell Miss Patrice about a different stop," I said. I knew how bus rules worked. Parents had to call the school. There was a whole form. Mr. Haas said nothing else. He turned his eyes back to the road. I went back to my seat. I turned to Marcus in the back and tried to explain what was happening, but Marcus was 12 and more concerned with showing his friends something on a Game Boy, and he told me to chill out. 2 stops later, Mr. Haas pulled the bus to the side of the road. Not a real stop, just the shoulder between 2 neighborhoods. He opened the doors. Curtis stood up. He walked to the front of the bus with that same strange steadiness. No backpack swinging, no sound from his sneakers. He stepped off. The doors closed. The bus pulled away. I pressed my face to the window and watched Curtis standing on the gravel shoulder of a road I didn't recognize, in front of nothing. No house, no driveway, no mailbox, just a stretch of road and a line of pine trees. He was standing very still, watching the bus drive away. And even from that distance, even at that speed, I could see that he was smiling. Marcus finally looked up from the Game Boy when I started crying. He came to sit next to me. By then it was too late to see where Curtis had gone. I told my mother everything the moment I got home. She called the school. The school checked their records and told her that Curtis had been signed out early that day by his father, that he'd never been on the bus at all that afternoon. I know what I saw. Marcus, to his credit, backed me up. He said he saw a small boy get off the bus at an unmarked stop, but he hadn't seen the boy's face, hadn't known it was Curtis, hadn't heard the conversation. The school maintained that Curtis was not on the bus. Here is what I found out later, not then, but much later when I was old enough to search public records on my own. Curtis's family had moved out of Dunmore Hills in December of that same year. I could find no forwarding information. The house sold, the family vanished from every local record I could find. I tried to look up Curtis by his last name, Weller, in the Atlanta area, and I found a brief news item from a small local paper dated about 8 months after what I saw on the bus. It was a missing persons notice. A boy named Curtis Weller, age 7, had been reported missing by his mother. There was a photograph. It was him. The notice said he'd last been seen leaving his school on a Tuesday afternoon in October. That was the same day I watched him step off bus 19 onto an empty road and smile at something I couldn't see. He was never found, not that I could discover in any record available to me. Mr. Haas never drove bus 19 after Miss Patrice came back. The school said he'd been a one-time fill-in and was no longer in their system. I asked Miss Patrice once, carefully, if she knew him. She said the name didn't ring a bell and that she didn't know who drove her route when she was sick because dispatch handled substitutes. I have spent 27 years working with children. I have become an expert in the things that hurt them and the things that take them away. But I still don't have an explanation for what I saw on bus 19. I still don't know what Curtis was smiling at. And some nights, when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering if the person who showed up that day in the driver's seat, the quiet man with the gray hair who knew exactly which stop had no houses, was a person altogether. Or if he was something else, something that collects children from the spaces between stops. I don't know. I just know that Curtis smiled, and that whatever was waiting for him in those trees, he seemed to already know it. That's the part that keeps me awake. I'm going to tell you something my family has never fully accepted as real. My dad calls it the nightmare I convinced myself happened. My mom doesn't talk about it at all. My little sister, who was there, grew up and moved to Canada and refuses to discuss it under any circumstances. She blocked me on social media 3 years ago when I posted about it publicly for the first time. That's how real this is to us. Real enough to cause a fracture that 20 years of family dinners never quite healed. I was 14. My sister Becca was 9. We lived outside a town called Garnet Falls in northern Minnesota, about 30 miles from the Canadian border. If you know northern Minnesota, you know what November fog looks like up there. It comes in off the lakes, and it doesn't just reduce visibility, it changes the landscape. Roads you've driven 100 times look wrong. Trees appear where you don't remember trees. It's thick and gray, and it moves. We rode the same bus, me and Becca. The route was long, 45 minutes each way, because we lived far out in the county. Our bus driver was a man named Roy Dempsey, who was loud and jokey and whom my parents considered a friend. Roy had a CB radio in the bus that he used to chat with other drivers, and you could always hear the static crackle and the distant voices from the front. On November 14th, I know the date because it's written in a journal I kept that year, there was heavy fog. School was not canceled, which in retrospect seems insane, but this was the 90s in a small Minnesota town, and school got canceled for about one reason: apocalyptic snowfall. Fog didn't count. The morning ride was fine. The fog was bad, but Roy drove slow and knew the road. The afternoon was different. We loaded up around 3:15. There were maybe 18 kids on the return run. The fog had thickened over the day and was now genuinely impenetrable. I'm talking 10 feet of visibility, maybe less in places. Roy drove at a crawl. The CB radio crackled constantly. I sat 5 rows back and could barely see the windshield. We were about 20 minutes into the route when Roy made a turn I didn't recognize. I'd ridden this bus for years. I knew every turn. This wasn't one of them. A hard right onto what looked like a gravel road. I remember thinking he was maybe taking a detour, avoiding something on the main road. I didn't say anything. We drove down the gravel road for several minutes. Becca, sitting next to me, had fallen asleep with her head against the window. A few other kids were asleep. The ones who were awake were looking at their books or staring at nothing. Then Roy stopped the bus. There was nothing ahead of us that I could see through the fog, just the gray wall of it and the gravel road disappearing into it. Roy picked up the CB radio. He said something into it, quietly, with his back to us, so I couldn't hear the words. There was a long pause. And then, from the speaker, a voice came back. I want to be careful about how I describe this. It wasn't a scary voice in the way you'd imagine. It wasn't a monster growl. It was a human voice, male, calm, older. But the way it spoke was wrong. The cadence was wrong. There were pauses in places that didn't make grammatical sense, like a person reading words in a language they don't understand, guessing at the rhythm. It said, "You have. More than last time. Good. Drive them to the..." And then static cut the rest off. Roy lowered the CB. I sat completely still. I don't know what I thought was happening. My brain was trying to build an explanation, some kind of work communication between drivers, some code I didn't understand. But something deeper in me, something animal and old, was screaming. I reached over and shook Becca awake. She looked at me confused, and I put my finger to my lips. She read my face. My sister has always been able to read my face. I leaned toward the aisle and looked at the front of the bus. Roy was sitting still with his hands on the wheel, waiting. Then, out of the fog, a shape appeared in the road ahead of us. It moved toward the bus slowly. As it got closer, I could see it was a person, a man, walking toward us through the fog. He was wearing dark clothing. He walked directly to the bus door. Roy opened it. The man stepped up onto the bus. I don't have adequate words for what happened next in my body. It was like every system shut down at once, because the man who stepped onto the bus looked at all of us, swept his eyes down the rows of kids, one face at a time, slowly. And his expression was not the expression of a person who has unexpectedly boarded a school bus. He looked like he was counting inventory. He said something to Roy in a low voice. Roy nodded. And then I stood up. I still don't know exactly why I did it. Something in me just stood up. I was 14 and I was terrified, and I stood up and I said, loudly enough for every kid on the bus to hear, "This is not our route. We need to go back." Dead silence. The man at the front turned to look at me. Roy turned to look at me. I held on to the back of the seat in front of me because my legs were shaking. "This is not our route," I said again. "I know this route. We don't come this way." Becca reached up and grabbed my hand. The man said nothing. He looked at me for what felt like a full minute. Then he looked at Roy. Then he stepped back off the bus. Roy closed the door. And then Roy, without a word, put the bus in reverse and backed down that gravel road the entire way back to the main highway. He didn't speak for the rest of the drive. He dropped everyone off at their stops. When Becca and I got off, I stopped in the aisle and looked at Roy. His face was completely unreadable. I said, "Who was that man?" Roy said, "Go home, Aaron." I went home. I told my parents immediately. My dad called Roy that night. Roy told me we'd gotten briefly turned around in the fog and that he had pulled over to consult a map. He said there had been no man. He said I'd been confused by the fog and my imagination. My parents believed Roy. 3 weeks later, Roy Dempsey resigned from his position. I heard he moved away from Garnet Falls entirely. My parents said he'd been having health problems. I tried to find Roy about 10 years ago. I found a death notice. Roy Dempsey of Garnet Falls, Minnesota died in 2008. The notice said he was survived by no immediate family. There was no cause of death listed. I've thought about this so many times that I've worn grooves in my brain trying to find the edges of an explanation. Maybe Roy was confused. Maybe the fog disoriented him. Maybe the man on the CB and the man who boarded the bus had some mundane connection I couldn't understand at 14. But something deeper in me, something animal and old, was screaming. Here's what I keep coming back to, and it's the reason I'm still telling this story 20 years later. Every kid on that bus was dropped off that day. Every single one of us made it home. And I cannot stop wondering, would we have if I hadn't stood up? The voice on the CB said, "You have more than last time. More than last time. Last time." Which means it had happened before, which means Roy had been on that road, in the fog, with a bus full of children. And whatever that man was counting from the door of the bus, whatever inventory he was taking, I think I interrupted something that had worked before without interruption. I think the only reason any of us went home that day was because a terrified 14-year-old stood up on shaking legs and said 3 words out loud. I became a father 8 years ago. My daughter rides the school bus. I have never told her this story. I don't think I ever will. But every single day, without exception, I watch from the window until the bus disappears around the corner. And every single day, I wait by the door until she comes home. Every day. Because I know something other parents don't. I know that sometimes the bus doesn't take you home. Sometimes it takes you somewhere else entirely. And sometimes nobody ever notices you didn't come back. I grew up in a small town called Millhaven in rural West Virginia. I know, everyone who tells a story like this says they grew up in a small town. But Millhaven was the kind of small that people forget to put on maps. 1 gas station, 1 diner, 1 elementary school that also served as the middle school because there weren't enough kids to fill 2 buildings, and 1 school bus route, Route 7, that snaked through about 14 miles of back roads to pick up and drop off roughly 30 kids, scattered across farms and trailer parks and gravel driveways that disappeared into the tree line. The bus driver was a man named Carl Breeder. He'd been driving that same route for 22 years. He knew every kid by name, knew which dog would chase the bus on Miller Road, knew exactly when to slow down before the blind curve near the creek. He was the kind of man that parents trusted completely because he'd been there longer than most of the parents themselves. I want you to remember Carl's name because Carl is part of what happened, and not in the way you'd expect. It was November, a Tuesday. I remember because we had a spelling test on Wednesdays and I'd forgotten to study, so I was sitting in the 3rd seat from the back, trying to cram from my notebook while the bus bounced along. There were 9 of us on the afternoon return trip. Most of the other kids had been dropped off by the time we hit the back half of Route 7, the dark part, where the trees close in on both sides, and the road gets so narrow that 2 cars can barely pass each other. There were 9 of us. Me, my friend Reggie, who sat next to me, a girl named Tasha, who always wore the same red jacket, 4 younger kids in the front, all 3rd graders who got picked up last and dropped off last, and 2 high school kids in the very back who barely acknowledged the rest of us existed. We were about 4 miles from my stop when Carl slowed the bus down. I looked up from my notebook. We weren't at a stop. There was nothing on either side of the road except dark tree trunks and underbrush. The sun had already dropped below the hills, and the sky was that deep gray that comes right before full dark. Carl had stopped the bus completely. He sat there with both hands on the wheel, not moving, not saying anything. Reggie nudged me. Why'd he stop? I didn't know. I looked out the window. Nothing. Just road and trees and the cold November air pressing against the glass. Then Carl turned around in his seat. His skin was the color of old wax. His eyes were wide and not blinking, and he was staring at a spot somewhere in the middle of the bus, not at any of us specifically, but between us, like he was looking at something that was sitting in the aisle. "Everyone stay in your seats," he said. His voice was completely flat. "Do not move. Do not make noise." One of the 3rd graders in the front started to cry. Carl held up one hand toward her without looking at her. "Quiet," he said. Soft but absolute. The little girl went silent. Reggie grabbed my arm. Carl slowly turned back to face the windshield. He was looking at something outside. I pressed my face against the window and strained to see through the gray light. There was a figure standing in the road, maybe 40 feet ahead of the bus, just at the edge of where the headlights reached. It was standing completely still, facing the bus. It was the shape of a person, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but something about the proportions was wrong in a way that I couldn't name then and still struggled to describe now. It was too long in some places, too narrow in others. It just stood there in the headlights, not moving. "What is that?" Reggie whispered. Carl reached down beside his seat and picked up something I'd never seen him carry before. A flashlight. A big one, the kind construction workers use. He clicked it on and aimed it through the windshield. The beam hit the figure and it flinched. I want to be clear about this. It flinched away from the light, like something alive, like something that didn't want to be seen. And in that half second of motion, I saw enough to understand that it was not an animal. It moved the way a person moves, but it was not a person. It stepped off the road, into the tree line, and disappeared. The whole bus was silent for 10 full seconds. Then Carl put the bus in gear and drove. He didn't say anything. He drove faster than he normally did, missing the slowdown before the blind curve, his knuckles white on the wheel. He dropped each of us off at our stops without a word. When he stopped at mine, I stood up on shaking legs and walked to the front. I wanted to ask him what it was. I wanted him to tell me it was a deer or a person in a costume or literally anything with a normal explanation. I looked at him as I stepped off. He was staring straight ahead, and he said, very quietly, without turning to look at me, "Don't come to the back of the bus tomorrow. Sit in the front." I got off. The doors closed behind me. The bus drove away. I told my mom. She called the school. The school said Carl had driven Route 7 that afternoon and reported nothing unusual in his log. When my mom pushed, they said they'd look into it. They didn't. I sat in the front seat for the rest of that school year. Carl retired the following June. I heard from Reggie's mom that he had moved away from Millhaven entirely, back to wherever he came from, somewhere down south. Nobody seemed to know exactly where. I tried to find him a few years ago when I started thinking about all of this more seriously. His name doesn't appear in any directory I could find. No obituary, no social media, just gone. But here's the part that still makes my chest tight when I think about it. The part I've never told anyone. About a week after that night, I was cleaning out my backpack and found a page that had fallen out of my notebook. I hadn't written on both sides, but when I turned this particular page over, there was writing on the back. Not my handwriting. It was written in pencil, in cramped, uneven letters, like whatever was writing hadn't fully figured out the mechanics of holding a pen. And what it said was only 4 words, written over and over, filling the entire back of the page. "I know your stop." I burned the page in our backyard that same afternoon. I've never told my mother. I've never told Reggie. I've never told anyone. Until right now. I still live with the lights on, and every time I hear the sound of an air brake releasing, that long mechanical hiss school buses make when they stop, my whole body goes cold. Because whatever was standing in that road knew me. It knew where I got off. And I have spent 19 years telling myself it never followed me home. I'm just not completely sure that's true.